lived at a time when there was significant change taking place in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and in the European world. But even today, we know that people do not miss a trick to kind of allude to the influence that is always with us, having to do with the impact of the icons that are associated with Gustav Klimt. Now, according to what is the most interesting or the most compelling for individual artists and people working in the arts and sciences in general, is they have a certain personality type, and they focus on those things that are the most dear to them. Sometimes the artists act as educators or social critics, or they're informers, or they're humorists, like say someone like Norman Rockwell would be looked upon as a humorist. However, he is a man that has some very deep stories to tell, and we'll discuss him down the road as well, because he's a very important representation of 20th century, early 20th century Americana. But as you can see, artists play sometimes one role, and sometimes they play 6 or 7 roles. At the end of this lecture, we will see what kind of an impact Klimt had, and you will see that he was covering many categories of what his attempt was to create this kind of new, unique society. So generally speaking, when we know that when we are studying the arts, we focus then on the times of the artist and what is happening in his culture, so that he will have a voice that will be equal to what is going on in the culture that he lives in at the time. So Vienna, as we all know, is one of the most beautiful cities in the European continent. And it has an illustrious history, because luminaries like Mozart and Beethoven and Sigmund Freud and Egon Schiele, Gustav Klimt, Ludwig Wittgenstein, so many big names in the 1800s and even into the 20th century will have an impact on the world, because this city was changing dramatically. And when there are lots of changes that are taking place, there are lots of voices that want to answer the call to representing that moment, because there are many possibilities, many ways to represent that moment, because so many changes are taking place. Now, Vienna, Austria is the glittering capital of Austria. However, we know that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was extensive. And what happens over this 400 plus year period where they dominated this part of the European world, they were very strong. And Franz Joseph the First, who was the emperor that we will be very much intertwined with in our lecture today, because he's a man that led that country, that empire, I should say, for 68 years. He's one of the longest lived monarchs in the European history. I think Queen Elizabeth has just kind of beat him by maybe a year, sitting on the throne a little bit longer than 68 years. So what happens with the empire is he makes Vienna the capital in the 1800s, and he does it for a very good reason, which we will see momentarily. So obviously he is a man that is Austro-Hungarian Germanic, and he has all kinds of other nationalities that live under his rule. He's going to be one of the only 2 empires that still exist in the 1800s. Just about all other empires have been broken apart, and nationals took their own identity and broke away from an emperor or a tsar. And consequently, what we have is this nation that is overseen, this empire that oversees Hungarians and Czechs and Croats and Romanians and Slovaks, even Italians, some Italians. So he is going to have a lot to contend with, because when he comes to power, the very year that he comes to power in 1848, he is only 18 years old and takes a bride very quickly so that he can have a king and queen there as rulers. And what happens in 1848 that is so significant for European and Western history is it was a year of revolution. 1848, all of these various strike points that you see in various locations. In the Italian world, they were trying to unify as one nation. So there was a lot of upheaval there. And then you can see all of the various strike points under Franz Joseph. Now, when this happens is Franz Joseph knows very quickly, if he is going to oversee so many different nationalities that want to have their own government and their own way to determine their life, they want presidents or democratically elected leaders that speak their own language, that have this contact with their culture that is unique to them, rather than a man that is essentially a man that has been born to the crown that really has very little in common with their individual regions. Well, what Franz Joseph does, which was a brilliant move, was that he metaphorically and physically opened himself up. He opened up his government by showing all of those nations that he was ruling over, that he was a man that was going to be open to everyone's ideas. And one of the ways that he did this that was such a significant thing is he took down the fortification walls that had been up for hundreds of years around this principality, which was originally the Principality of Vienna. So when he took down those fortification walls, he created 3 miles, a circle that was 3 miles long and wide, that eventually became the ring road, the Ringstrasse, in which he created opportunities for lots of innovative new buildings and new ideas that were going to be constructed here to take the place of that area that was now empty and open for building. Now, what he did was, which again was quite interesting, because Vienna did not have a particular architectural style that would be associated with, say, Austro-Hungary or even Austria or their empire. Consequently, what happened was all of this opportunity to build was going to create a way for Franz Joseph to bring disparate people together under a huge culture or even high culture umbrella. And you need buildings for this, because what he wanted to do is under great symphonic music, under art museums, creating buildings that have opera entertainments. He was going to bring people under this wonderful venue in which they could enjoy high culture together. And high culture is not nationalistic. It's something that appeals to everyone across the board because it has already been stamped as high culture and high art. Now, making the choices, of course, as to what kind of buildings will go up for what specific reason is we now have him building on the Ring Road, the Parliament building. Now, as you know, generally speaking, if you're an emperor, then all the power lies with you, and you are living behind fortification walls, and you are the ones that makes all the determinate decisions that are going to have impact on citizens. So again, as an important visual, what he did was, because this is good optics for everyone, is that he had a parliament building built in an area that is now open to the suburbs. And he built it in the style, which you can see here. The architects decided they were going to build it in a historical style. And that historical style was Greece. So one of the reasons that they particularly chose to be associated with Greece is because Greece had the first democracy in the world about 500 years BCE. And consequently, what they're going to do is build a construction that is representational of the Parthenon, which was built to celebrate the democracy of Greece. This is not a standalone building, because with the Parthenon, you had the Parthenon built in honor of the goddess Athena. So the goddess Athena became sort of the symbol of Vienna at this time. Not only do we have the association there of democracy and democratic ideals, but we also have this feminized version of virtue. The goddess that is the goddess of craft. She's very crafty herself. She is the goddess of negotiated war as opposed to bloody war. Now, what did they do when they wanted to build then the City Hall building? Because now we have the Parliament where laws are being made and where different people come from different regions to represent the interests of their people. Then we have the next building that was decided on was the City Hall building. It too was done in this historical style that is known as Neo-Gothic, because the Gothic era, the Dark Ages, let's say, or the early Renaissance, was one of the first times in history that merchants and guilds became so strong that they determined what kind of laws and what kind of traditions would be instituted in their culture. So City Hall, again, a building that represents the power and people, this combined association. The third building is the building that was the museum. And consequently, since the museum was built in this Renaissance style, which you can see this kind of dome, which would be like the Pantheon dome. This is built in this way because the Renaissance was in the high Renaissance, 1500s, a moment in which high learning was being reconstituted in many ways and brought to average people with the printing press. So what we have then is a moment in which literacy and culture and interest in sophisticated art forms is represented in this building. They want to associate themselves with the greatness of the Renaissance. And then the opera building was built in the Baroque style. The Baroque style is around the 1600s when opera became a new art form. So you can see what's happened here. They made very important choices according to what they wanted people to see. Because we all know, we've discussed this on numerous occasions, architecture is the backbone of your nation. Architecture is the most expensive art form, and it shows you what your nation stands for, and even more so, what it aspires to. It's no accident that in the 1920s, New York City became the capital of skyscrapers because we thought our potential for greatness was limitless. We were reaching for the stars. Well, just as a side note here, these beautiful decorative elements that we see here, that is gold on the exterior of the Parliament building and the interior of the building, was done by Gustav Klimt, his brother, and another artist friend. And they were all in their late teens, early 20s when they were doing this kind of obviously very high quality classical style art. So these buildings that were going up, that were massive, required a lot of decoration. And so say they would see the opera house that was built at this time in the 1800s, that even exists today, still stands as this extraordinary monument of not only historical connections, but the decoration that we will see in a moment that's done individually in these buildings. So what you can imagine that is happening here is, if they're building 3 solid miles of massive buildings, and these buildings stand for something very big, there are going to be architects and designers and stonemasons and glaziers and people working in all aspects of everything having to do with what is required to put up these massive buildings. Never mind that these massive buildings can only be paid for by a king's coffer, because mind you, even around the 1900s, we already have some union activity and we have the rising costs of labor. So if you have very expensive materials and higher costs in labor, the average person cannot possibly ever afford to put up these kind of buildings. So we're going to see what's going to happen as a result of this. If you have more and more people coming to a major downtown center, you have to provide housing. So we'll see how architects are going to become tremendous problem solvers, because they're going to create a new style of architecture and design that is going to be able to have more for more people at a smaller price. Now, all this interest around the newness, everything that was new here, whether it was just a visual representation or it was actually a lot of new ways of thinking about the world, were happening here because of the changes under Franz Joseph I, is that people came from all over the world, particularly young people, came here and sat in the coffee houses where they were observing the changes that were taking place. And in particular, since they understood that Franz Joseph was afraid that he was going to lose the power that his family had had for so many hundreds of years, he started to propose changes that made his government more liberal. And if this was the case, there was a lot of interest around the end of the 1800s, beginning 1900s, in new styles of government. So guess who showed up in these coffee houses? The future leaders of the 20th century were there, because they wanted to understand how these changes and what kind of impact it will have on people if rulers have more compassion and have more interest in not only seeking power for themselves, but change and improving lives for others. Now, it's quite interesting too to note that since the Austrian Empire had been in place for such a long time, and it looked like it was going to crumble, and of course everyone knew that eventually it would come to pass, because democracies were becoming a fact of life in the 1800s in various countries, and consequently people were very, very nervous as to what was going to happen. How does one sort of spring off this hundreds of years of inculcated thought and government policy and make themselves very modern and new, and in particular, since people wanted their own particular regional leaders. Not for nothing, then, do we have this interest around neurology. As you know, Sigmund Freud was an MD. He was a neurologist. He was a neurologist that started to propose ideas that no one had ever contemplated, or they had contemplated them and played them out, say, in Greek tragedy or in drama, but he gave us a way to discuss various matters that have to do with human development, the thought system, and he also gave us a vocabulary, very important vocabulary with which to discuss these kinds of changes. So he is a man that is born from an age of anxiety, and we will see in a few more minutes how this will all become intertwined in the life of Klimt, because we also know today, of course, that if people suffer from a lot of anxious feelings, they begin to have bowel problems as a result. There is a connection between the two. Freud was a man that loved Greek mythology, and he loved the ancient world. I mean, not for nothing does he call his social science psychology, from the goddess Psyche. And not only does he use terms that come from the Greek world, like id, ego, superego, and Oedipal complex, for example, he's a man that loves everything having to do with the classical world. And in fact, he formulated a lot of his ideas in one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, bar none, is the library in Vienna. Now, what happens with Freud is, as we all know, these kinds of decorations that with metal, with bronze, with brass, with gold trimmings, with all of these various decorative aspects of these buildings and how expensive they are to put up, make it almost impossible to create any kind of real housing for people that are going to live more simply, because labor costs are going up and materials are expensive as well. So one of the significant things that begins to happen is that a group of architects, in particular, this man's name is Loos, I believe is how you say his name, Loos, and this is the Loos house, in which he starts to use the simplest of materials like concrete. It's not a marble, and it's not brass, and it's not bronze, and it's not this, and it's not that. It is a very simple building to put up, and a place where, say, an entrepreneur can put up this apartment building, and he can charge reasonable rents too, so that it can be a profitable and utilitarian way to create a new style of building in which form follows function, in which you design a building. In this case, you're designing apartments that have to have air and windows and so on and so forth. And this secession, or this young style, had sort of the epitome of this movement was this art museum that we discussed a few months ago that was paid for by Carl Wittgenstein, a very wealthy steel manufacturer. So what happens in this building that becomes significant is that Albrecht is trying to create a temple to a new way of experiencing and living in the world by making the first art museum, which will have ribbons of windows on the sides here. And it will also have a very large skylight, which will be protected by this bronze kind of cabbage look, but it's laurel wreaths. In fact, most people still refer to this building as the Cabbage Building. And you ascend into the temple. So you see how he very specifically did this. If this is supposed to be a temple to art, it's a new temple to modern art, where you're going to have lots of light, because modern art can be best viewed with lots of light, as opposed to the ancient works, which are typically seen in darker rooms. So what happens here, you are ascending. You will go up to this new temple, taking these ideas from the Parthenon. So you can see how this is always a part of art history. Art historians know everything about the topic in which they are working. If they're architects, they know the whole history of architecture. If they're sculptors, and so on and so forth. So he is making this brand new idea and connecting it to the ancient world. Now, the man that became sort of the head, the artist that became the head of this secession movement, because they want to secede from the classical style of art, which is, we said before, Gothic, Renaissance, Greek or Roman. They want to secede from those ideas altogether, and even the way that art has been taught historically as well. Gustav Klimt, as you can see, is the man that is sitting there like Zeus on his throne. He is the uber god of all of these people, who are also many older than he is. And they begin to publish a journal called Sacred Spring, in which they are going to educate the public as to what their ideas are. And what are their ideas? Well, they want to move away from tradition. They have respect for tradition, and it has a place, but you have to understand that this is Gustav Klimt, and he's now in his probably mid-20s, early 30s. He's only going to live about 55 years anyway. But what will happen with him is he will be traditionally trained. Klimt will be traditionally trained as a young student. And this is some of the work that he will do as a very young man, which is very typically classical. And of course, this is the kind of work that he will become internationally known for, because he's going to change his mind as to what kind of art is representational of his period. Now, one of his students is Egon Schiele. And Egon Schiele was a man that was frankly peculiar, a peculiar kind of unique character who took it upon himself to become part of this new expressionist, this German expressionist movement. And there are very often in this expressionist movement elements of the grotesque. He became known for doing numerous self-portraits, and though he himself only lived 28 years, he did numerous, in the thousands, these kind of self-portraits, which show him in ways that are singularly unattractive, and in fact have these kind of elements of the grotesque. I really can't, kind of raw sexuality. There's an intensity in his work. No one has ever shown pubic hair in this way, and the human body in these kind of unprecedented sexually direct representations that made uptight Germanic people very upset. What will happen with him is he is going to live in a period in which he will see lots of things that are not very pretty. Though there are lots and lots of amazing buildings that are going up all around him, there's also a lot of horror that is taking place because people are being displaced from their homes. Even if they lived in tenements, they were being displaced and they were becoming homeless. And in fact, they were living in the most despicable conditions. They were living in the sewers. They were living in the sewers of Vienna under incomprehensible squalor. And most of them naturally turned to alcoholism and prostitution and to the most unhealthy ways of living. And they were already living in a damp, dirty, disgusting place. So one of the reasons that he makes this picture, which is in some ways an autobiographical picture of a woman that was in love with him, who he left, and this is this lovely woman that was his girlfriend for some 4 years or so, and he eventually is going to leave her and marry a woman that is wealthy and can help support him. So we see what is happening here that is very upsetting. She is emaciated, and everything about this has those elements of discomfort, of dark and death, and his skin is already turned a color that would be the color of a cadaver. So when he was explaining himself and he was saying to the public, because this is one of the things that the Sacred Spring Journal would have been writing stories about, is not only is he talking about the kind of the devastation of the city for impoverished people, but there were yet uglier things that were taking place. And that was a new kind of, what is not known yet, but a Nazi movement, basically, in which the mayor of Vienna is elected, Karl Lueger, under the Christian Social Party, and he ran as this populist demagogue that was pushing anti-Semitism. That was the platform he ran on, that he was going to get Jews out of jobs that were part of the high society in Vienna. And who is going to be the man that will laud him for his ideas and replicate them is none other than Hitler. So seeing these kinds of things around him and knowing the kind of poison that was happening at this time, Schiele is holding up he's holding up a mirror to society. He is showing the ugliness because he is that kind of teacher. He is the kind of person that wants you to understand that the horror that is taking place is something that we should be aware of, and consequently these kind of disquieting images are conveying that. Now, there were in fact others that were taking a different tack. Say in the case of Gustav Mahler, is what he was doing. Number one, he is very well known when we will discuss his one of his wives in future lectures. whose name was Alma Mahler. You can see by all of her last names, she never met a man. She didn't marry. I have that in common with her too, unfortunately. But but what happens with her is she's a very talented composer, author, editor, socialite. She was
Fowler's wife had a very long last name because she never met a man she didn't marry. Gail said,
yeah.
that's true too.
Gail, you're going to have to mute yourself. Okay, so here's what happens. So Gustav Mahler, he is taking a different tack. Instead of focusing on the ugliness in Viennese society, he is going to write lots of compositions, symphonic compositions that have kind of meditative aspects and kind of this love for nature and love for folk tunes and these kinds of things that will have kind of a purity symphonically, but at the same time are connecting themselves to the simple folk that live in the countryside. Ludwig Wittgenstein, who we discussed some lectures before, Wittgenstein was a man who was trying to sort of make a more equal world by helping people understand through his philosophical investigations having to do with language. Though he is a fantastic mathematician and physicist, he will write about, he will attempt to explain to people why is it that we have problems with misunderstanding each other. And that is that when we talk about subjects, we have certain pictures in our mind and the other person has pictures that are opposite to ours. Well, it was quite an interesting treatise that he wrote, and it was looked upon as a contribution that was made by a very intelligent philosophical intellectual. Now, what we have with another musician who became much more modern in his attitude toward music, his name was Arnold Schoenberg, and he is a man that is going to write about music and develop his own kind of expressionistic movement in which he insists that all the keys are equal, whether they're black or they're white, and he will write music that sounds pretty noisy and unsettling, but he was innovative in his way. You can listen to some of his work on YouTube. It's quite interesting. You should be exposed to it to be culturally literate, but there's nothing about his music that is settling, let's say. It's just a way of looking at the keyboard and at music in a democratized fashion. Now, Schoenberg was run out of Vienna because he was Jewish, and one of his neighbors from so many years before was this lady, and this lady is the one that is the niece of Adele Bloch-Bauer, the woman in gold. And in future years, Arnold Schoenberg's grandson, Randall Schoenberg, is going to help this woman, Maria Altmann, get the painting back to her family. Now, what will happen with Klimt is he will be born to an impoverished family in which there were 3 sons and maybe 3 or 4 daughters. And they all lived pretty much in abject poverty, though their father was a gold engraver. And gold engraving did not, and working with gold until maybe even recent years, was never really considered an art form so much as someone that was a hand worker. So his father never earned a very big wage, but he did produce 3 sons who were enormously artistically talented. The father was a Sunday painter, but the boys were the ones that just absolutely had the touch of angels on them. This is Gustav here. His brother Ernst, who will only live about 28 years or so, are going to produce this kind of work when they're teenagers. So we know that what will happen with them, because they are such gifted young men, they are not going to be accepted to the premier art school which would be something like RISD in the United States. They would not be accepted to those schools because they didn't have prestige or connections probably, but they were accepted to a school that was a little beyond a kind of in prestige, below that premier art school, and it was sort of a technical slash art school. Well, what happens is they are making this kind of work as teenagers, as I said. If they're making these kind of works, which might be more classically inspired, and you can say that these are people from, you know, the Renaissance period or whatever, or they're making these kind of paintings that tell fables, illustrations for fables, the professors know that they are enormously talented and that there's going to be wonderful opportunities for young men like him because so many of these huge buildings need decoration. To show you how gifted Gustav Klimt was, when he was maybe 15, 16 years old, one of the teacher's requirements was that every student learn to use a pencil and make a representation that looked like a photograph, I quote, but more romantic. So this is the kind of work that at the age of 15, Klimt is turning out a portrait of his father done in pencil. Now the father, as I said, is a hand worker, and he does this kind of work probably for a master jeweler when he can get the work. So we can see that there are these kind of connotations that sort of make their way into Gustav Klimt's designs in later years. This is the tree of life, and we can even see that there's this Orientalization influence that has happened here, because the influence of the Japanese world, as we can see, is there, and it's being made smack dab in the middle of this Art Nouveau period, which is very, very much influenced by the Orientalization of the Western world. The other thing that you can see is the blackbird, the ever-present blackbird, which is like a memento mori symbol, which is to say a symbol that will always reminds you that your lifespan is short, and consequently you should live a good life because you never know when the good Lord will take you. Well, we see kind of this radial design, which will become a significant motif for the way that Klimt will do his later work. That is yet to come. But what happens is that the most impressive artist of this period, or one of the most impressive artists of this period, is a man called Hans Makart, who made these kind of portraits of society women and gave them, say in this case, a Roman Tsar's wife, wife's name, so that if it didn't sell in a proper art show where people are looking for classical works, then this probably wealthy lady who is sitting for him will purchase it as her portrait. Well, he was a man that did a lot of decorative things, which we'll see again, a few more pieces by Makart, but he did something most unusual for this period, and that is he started to make these kind of illustrations of women as, say in this case, the five senses, taste or sight, smell, and he was going to be extremely influential for those people that were going to make lots of commercial art at this time to sell products. As you know, female form and Art Nouveau go very beautifully together because women's bodies are curvy, and Art Nouveau has to do with kind of these whiplash designs. So we're going to talk about Alphonse Mucha next time that we're together, but we can see that he too is now adopting this idea of the four seasons personified as women, and all of these lovely kind of sinewy shapes that have to do with nature forms, and that it just screams Art Nouveau. Now, Makart was a man that not only worked in various arts and lithographs and all of these things, but he became a well-known interior designer. And he became one of the first people that started to use, say, Renaissance chairs with the kind of lighting that would be used in say in a hunting lodge. So he did this kind of mixed classical stuff with more earthiness and things that were brought from the Orient, and again Renaissance style decor. So this was known as Makart Stil, as it was specific to him, this kind of unique process of mixing all of the wonderful things that you could buy in markets now because of transportation worldwide and industrialization, and consequently more people had more money and their homes were more decorated. So what you see that is happening here is a very, very different thing than we see just say 2 decades later. 2 decades later, we see that there has been the embrace of the machine. Lots of these things will be mass produced, even though there will be a lot of work in them. There will not be the same kind of work that is required for all of this cutting and engraving and all of this work that is going to be done here. This is all handwork. And here's what we begin to see is a room that is far more simplified. And one of the attributes of this room that makes it so attractive is there are going to be more windows that will let light in, and people's lifestyle will change just because of these significant elements. Now, the buildings that were going up at this time, say between the 1860s or even a little bit before that, maybe 1850s, 60s, 70s, all of these buildings that take some of them many decades to complete. When the Court Theater was finished, Gustav and Ernst Klimt, they create this union, brother artists. They're going to add another friend with them as well. But being that they're at this point decorating a theater, they're going to make connection with stories that are told in theaters. And so this is the connection to sort of fables. And we have this association of muscular men that has to do with what you would have seen in the Greek world in these kind of sculpture pieces, the perfected athlete, the perfected leader is represented in the perfect body. And this is this association with Greek theater. The two brothers won gold medals and lots of ribbons from Franz Joseph. And Franz Joseph commissioned them to make a portrait painting, I should actually say, of this impressive theater. Well, what Gustav wanted to do, which he thought would make it a far more interesting painting, because a building is dead, a building has stone that, nothing breathes in it. What he decided to do was, instead of making a painting of the theater itself, he decided to make a portrait, as these people would all have been recognizable figures, well-known people that are patrons, many of them patrons of the arts. So they are working with Franz Joseph. These people that are so well-heeled, so wealthy, have some of the best seats, some of the best seats, of course, up here. These people all want to support Franz Joseph because they don't want the empire to fall. And they are interested in underwriting cultural events so that the people can be absorbed and unified in a way that will make them be proud to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now the brothers, as I said, this is again Gustav, his brother Ernst, and then Franz Match. All of them look quite a bit older than they really are, but they're just in their early 20s. And what they do is they start to make these kind of decorations in which they include themselves as these people that are part of the audience that are watching a play. And the play that they're watching is Romeo and Juliet. So effectively what we have is Klimt and associated artists, this company of artists, are telling the history in a very beautiful way of Greek theater, Roman theater, English theater, and connections to Shakespeare. And so they make these kind of decorations. Some of it might be fresco. I'm not 100% sure, but it's certainly very beautifully done and effective. Naturally, it has this close association with what the building stands for. Now, in terms of what is going to happen in this Fine Arts Museum, which will be considered one of the most glorious buildings altogether, this Renaissance style building, is this will be the first time that Klimt and his brother will begin to use this kind of gold foil. So this kind of, again, this is the story of art. So we have this representation of the halos from the Dark Ages or Byzantine art, and all of these various decorative elements that we see that represent, again, sort of stories from Roman theater, from Egyptian entertainments, and so forth. In celebration of Gustav Klimt's various years of birth and death and various celebrations, there has been an elevator that was developed that comes up, turned from here, and then they turn it so that people can see these magnificent pieces right there in front of their face. You can see that on the internet too. It's very interesting to see how close up you can get to it and see the detail. Now, what happens with Klimt at this point, which is a very big tragedy, is both his father and his brother that he's so close to and has had this close association with working and otherwise, they both die within something like a 2-year period. And when they do, Klimt goes into mourning and absolutely cannot do anything. He does begin to discover the poetry in the works of Charles Baudelaire, who is this new style poet, who begins to write about difficulties of people's lives that are the rag pickers and most impoverished people that are living in the streets of Paris now, which is also being rebuilt, and consequently lots of people are losing their homes and becoming homeless and even more impoverished than they were before. And the way that, say, Manet, who is a very good friend of Charles Baudelaire, the way that he begins to make illustrations of this kind of symbolist movement, which is rather than just painting something that is a realistic representation of something, it stands for something else. It's a symbol for something else. So say, in the case here, we're going to talk a lot more about Manet in lectures to come, but what happens here is that you see that this is obviously a very impoverished person, probably living on the streets, and this is just trash around him. But Baudelaire makes an important point in which in his poetry and his essay says that there can be a lot of beauty and dignity even in the man that has to live in substandard conditions. So interesting things were taking place here, because not only are we going to be introduced to these aspects of psychology and psychoanalysis and symbolism in the art world, what we can see that Edvard Munch is doing here is he is showing us this kind of age of fear and anxiety and melancholy, and at the same time he is making a representation of a symbol of this anxiety, which is not so easy to do. Well, together with this symbolist movement, we have a big new interest in spirituality. Spirituality was proposed by this Russian-American woman, Helena Blavatsky. She created a society that still exists today. They have lots of lectures through there, which are magnificent, the American Theosophical Society. What happened with her is she was trying to move people away from the rigidity of church dogma or strict dogma of any kind, and see the world as a mystical place, a spiritual place in which everyone can be intertwined and see each other as a unified humanity. And again, these ideas are all what we would call Luftgeschäft. These are all ideas that are being postulated now that have to do with things that live in the ether. They are not things that we can touch and hold. And so consequently, when we start to see this kind of art come to pass, it's because artists are grappling for a way to represent their life in times which are unique because the times are unique. Consequently, their art is. Now, what happens with Gustav Klimt is one of the first things he does is he begins to sort of study the great Renaissance men of the German world, which we will see in just a moment. And he is interested in reaching a kind of truth. He wants to reach a kind of truth because if you want to be a good humanist, you should deal with probably facts, with real life things, not fantasy, not things that have to do with Roman and Greek theater, not things that have to do with mythology, but maybe reality. So instead of him focusing, say, on the ancient world from the point of view of the contributions it made in storylines, he is now going to use a quote from one of the great Renaissance thinkers of his period, whose name was Schiller, or in German, I think they call him Schiele, Friedrich von Schiele. And he is with Goethe considered to be the great men of the Enlightenment of the German world. So it is one of the things that Schiele says is, it's written here in German, if you cannot please everyone with your actions and your art, you should satisfy a few. To please many is dangerous. Which is to say, if you are an artist that is pleasing a lot of people, you're not doing anything new. If you want to be a radical, then you have to do things that offend people. And that is one of the ways that you change things. So though we know that justice is blind, but truth can see. So what happens is with this personification of truth, we see that Klimt makes this picture then, which insults everyone imaginable, because number one, she has pubic hair, which is generally not done. He and Sheila are doing this, but people are not doing that as a general course. When you show a nude, she should be lying back, and she should not even be looking at you, the observer. She should be looking away. She should be demure. But this girl, not only is she there with her all-togethers, but she has red hair. And red hair is a further insult to Austria, because I think the Austrians were conquered by the Celts, were conquered by the Scotch, I think the Goths, all of these people that we know as the Goths and the Vandals had red hair. So the consequence of this is that he is now in many ways telling the Austro-Hungarians, you were conquered. You were conquered by people stronger than you. And she is holding up a mirror to society. And on top of that, there are lots of people that don't want to know the truth. There are lots of people, say even like Franz Joseph, that doesn't necessarily want to know the truth. And consequently, he is in many ways represented as this snake that will pull the truth off her pedestal. Well, let's say this about that, as good old President Nixon used to say, you don't make a lot of friends if you do this kind of work, if you want the establishment to embrace you. But interestingly enough, you see there was quite a dilemma that was being faced here by the empire. The empire was growing by leaps and bounds and making important contributions in various areas. Not only were they becoming innovators in arts and architecture and general changing of the worldview, as difficult and as painful as that is, they also had an incredible university system which added a school for medicine and various undertakings in the scientific and surgery world. So what happened was Gustav Klimt, because he had decorated the Kunst Museum, because he had decorated the Opera House, because of the Parliament work and all this, he was given a position as sort of a professor to instruct the premier art students of their day at this Vienna University. And he was also given the commission to decorate these amazing walls, or actually the walls, no, but the ceiling, I take it back. He did not do the decoration on the walls. He was supposed to create these paintings that exalted the pride that the Austrian world was taking in the fact that they were now the forerunners, in particular in medical, neurological research, and scientific research across the board. So what do they ask him to do? They ask him to decorate this ceiling, which is about 4 stories tall. That's a very, very high ceiling, about 40 feet tall. And so these paintings had to be very large so that you could see them from the ground. Now, this is a repainting of those pieces because they were destroyed during World War II. But there were lots of working drawings that Gustav Klimt was already working on and that he wanted to have on exhibition. Eventually, of course, they would be placed in this great hall, this communal hall, civic hall. But he was already working on them, getting them ready, and they were jurisprudence, medicine, and philosophy. All right, right, because laws were being changed and the Austrian liberalized. This is one of the reasons that they suggested he make a painting of jurisprudence, medicine, and philosophy, because their philosophy was changing, which of course always begins with liberalization of laws. He was working on these things and he had them on exhibition in the Universal Exposition that took place in Paris in 1900. This Universal Exposition was a grand and glorious moment for the French world. And there were artists from all over the world that were showing their work here. One of them, by the way, was Picasso. This is the first time the Stein family is going to be exposed to Picasso. But there were, in this exposition, there were buildings like Epcot buildings of all countries that were showing their best art and their best technological innovations and this and that. So Gustav Klimt had his work on exhibition here as a representative from Austria. And what he saw here is there were other symbolist painters, like in this case, this Belgian painter that was doing this kind of work. Again, it wasn't standing for the things that you see in reality, but the kind of poetic analogies to convey evocative moods, perhaps, or things that are unrealistic, maybe the kinds of things you would see in dreams. One of the people that had the most profound effect on Klimt himself was a man whose name was Torup, Jan Torup, who was Dutch and Indonesian background. He used a lot of gold and a lot of these flowing lines that you will see over and over again. These motifs are going to be adopted very quickly by Klimt because, again, they're representational of these things that live in the ether, the things that sort of flow through your mind like stream of consciousness. So kind of these fluid shapes are beginning to be part of the way that Klimt's language will evolve. And the other artist that had a profound effect at this exposition on Klimt was a man called George Min, who was also Belgian, who used a human body to convey inner emotions and spiritual conflict. So then we begin to see that those beautiful shapes, in this case, say that Klimt did as a student, those beautiful shapes that were representational of what you see in real life, The bodies are now being distorted because they stand for something. They try to capture the emotions, the suffering, the hope, the love that we have as humans, and the trials that we live through. All of this is going to make its way into these works, some of them which have been reworked and done in a way that has all of those attributes. So what happens here is this goes on exhibition. People don't know what to make of this, because if you are going to make a picture of philosophy, then what exactly is going on here? What are you showing the Viennese, people that are coming to an art show to see your work? What are you telling these people? He makes philosophy sort of into this anthropomorphic figure of a woman's face, as he gives her breasts, so it's a woman. Everybody is pretty much in the dark. Certainly this sea of people who all look condemned and living in the dark. There is some hope because there's something emerging from the darkness that is light. There are little specks of light, but these people are still very much kind of this continuous flow of people that are just mired in things that they have no control over, and their philosophy has not yet been enlightened. Okay, that's the first nail in the coffin. What's the next thing? As we said, the Viennese people, the universities, the powers that be had enormous pride when it came to these ideas that were studying not only the nervous system, the kind of the soft science of psychology and psychoanalysis, but because of the various bowel problems that were created, or came to pass as due to this high level of anxiety, they became the forerunners in abdominal surgery. And you can see no one is wearing a glove yet, so they don't even know that this contamination is disastrous. But we know that they are the forerunners in these very important subject matters. So when he makes this picture again of the sea of humanity, and of course this caduceus, or the snake that is from Greek mythology, that sheds its skin and becomes a symbol for life and renewal, as you know, in the medical world. And this is the goddess Hygiena, who has sisters that are like Panacea, and various sisters in the myths that help you forget the trauma of surgery and pain and so on and so forth. What do we see? We see a single woman in a position here where you have to look up at this work, and again, you're seeing things that you don't necessarily want to see. There is the potential of birth here because we see a child in a sack, and perhaps this woman whose one arm is connected to the sea of humanity, which experiences death and disease, and perhaps they are reaching out to her now as medicine. But here is the goddess medicine, and her back is turned away from mankind. So no one knows what in the heck he's trying to convey. Essentially, everyone looked at this as depraved. Everyone looked at this as insulting, and certainly in no way elevating the status of where they thought they were winning. They were winning in the sciences, and this is certainly not anything that represents that. And in terms of jurisprudence, what does he do? He shows us these three goddesses, again associated with the truth and justice. So we see truth, justice, and law here, who are all asleep, while this poor condemned man, who is being absorbed by the tentacles of the judiciary system that cares nothing for a man who is poor and powerless. What can I tell you? He won no friends here. He won absolutely no friends. And when he was condemned to the extent that he made the sort of the final insult picture in which he shows the public the bottom of this woman because he could care less what you think of him. Well, from this point forward, naturally, he's not going to be part of the university system. And he is also going to be a man that will hereafter only take private commissions, and he will no longer work for the public where he will be assailed by insults. There would be a number of people that will constantly be writing about the profundity of his work and why it should be taken seriously, but he is winning no favor with the general society. What will happen with his younger brother is going to marry into this family. In fact, let me just show you this picture first. His younger brother is going to, Helena, is going to have a child with Ernst Klimt. He's going to die about the age of 28, and she will have a little child with him, a little girl, I believe. And this is Gustav, who is going to become very closely enmeshed with this family of sisters and the Fluge family. So here he is with Emilie Fluge, who will become a lifelong companion and friend to him, though probably not a romantic interest. So she and her sister become very close with him, with Gustav, and they're going to be the fashion designers of their day, who you can see already are giving up the corset. They are women that have been heavily influenced by the Vienna workshop, which we will see in just a moment. But they are interested in designing clothing for women so that women can breathe, so that they can be comfortable. And they even make these kind of sarong pieces for Klimt. Now, the sisters open up their own design studio. The sisters, the Schwestern Fluge, and everything that they have here is very Art Nouveau-ish geometric style, which we've discussed before on numerous occasions. And they begin to design the kind of clothing that the most fashionable women of the day will want to have made. They're going to be heavily influenced by the Vienna workshop that was founded by these two men who were industrialists, who were furniture manufacturers and manufactured every kind of home good that you could possibly need that could be machine manufactured because cost of living and labor is very high, and consequently now they have to embrace the machine. And we have this interest around creating buildings that have nothing to do with anything that is considered neo-anything, neo-Renaissance, neo-classical, neo-Roman, nothing. It's something that is done with machine-made kind of geometric shapes that you can replicate, and this is how you kind of compose these buildings with far less money and less expensive decorative elements. So this is Wagner, who became one of the secession architect members. What Klimt does is he is the head of the secession movement, but he has to make a living. And as I said, he begins to take these private commissions. This young woman, who you can see is raring to get out of this chair with her straight back, she is ready to embrace life. She's dressed from the top to the bottom, laced up like a present. But she's a woman that is ready to move on with life. And he tells us that she has obviously a very passionate heart with the red book, and she has a little bit of a wild streak. She is a woman that is alive, and you can see she's ready to meet the world. So this is the kind of work that he does before that Vienna workshop. And this is 1898. And about 5 years later, he's already moved into a distinctly different style. The geometry of the machine, of fabrics that are printed, where there's a lot less decoration and flowy this and flowy that, it's something that can be more easily stamped, more easily replicated. And though he's doing this at the time of Art Nouveau, which we said is absolutely besotted by all things Oriental, he is also very interested in these intimate moments that the Japanese world captured during female, their toilette time, their private time. So we can see what the combination of ideas are here. He is in love with Oriental fabrics, with the decorations, with the silks. He's in love with these kind of gold backgrounds and motifs. And this is even a combination of the landscapes that he's going to do. So we have everything all together. This, lovely sensual relationship between a man and a woman, which we saw was so distinctly different than he did. Now, the landscape that we see here, though a lot of people are not aware of the fact that he did this kind of landscape pointillist style after his love and his exposure to Surah. And because of the spiritual nature of some of the work that Gauguin was doing at the very same time, we can see that what he's doing is he's bringing this element of spirituality and innovation and kind of these relationships of shapes and colors to each other. And we know very well that he could make this kind of French Impressionist style work, but he was moving on to this kind of refined design of patterns and figurative work, which was distinctly different. So being that he was the head of this secession movement that wanted to make the world anew, one of the things that they did when they built this significant building that became so representational of that moment is that we see that the laurel wreath, which was the laurel wreath which was given to an Olympics winner, is being used here, and the decoration of the female face and body and hair and all of these various attributes here that we see to decorate this very, very simple building. And above it, it tells us what they stand for. What does the secession stand for? To each age, it's art. To art, it's freedom. They want the kind of freedom in which they can, for example, show the works of Gustav Klimt. These were the originals that were destroyed in World War II. They sometimes hang paintings sitting on the floor. Sometimes, this could be doors, but they do this kind of thing as sitting on the floor. They're hanging this way, that way. So they're doing things very differently. And what will happen with Klimt is in this secession building, in that museum, is that he will make a beautiful, interesting frieze around 3 walls that will end in the story. And basically, it's a story of good versus evil, in which he illustrates that this golden night, representing the golden intentions of humanity to live in a world that is peaceful and righteous. And he's showing us that that we are always confronted with evil, with madness, with the tempestuous monsters. There's this picture of this monster here, which you can see a little bit better there. We're always having to fight those things that bring the worst kind of news to us. But everything always ends with the brotherhood of man. Very kind of invigorating story to tell us what the new world holds in store for us, and that we can overcome bad things by doing good things with compassion. One of the things that was on exhibition here was a sculpture piece in which Beethoven, who made Vienna his home for something like 36 years, that Max Klinger makes this honored representation of the artist, the misunderstood artist, the artist that is the scourge of society in his time, but is later appreciated, we can see that he's shown here effectively like Zeus in the way that we would see these pieces of Zeus or Jupiter, say, in the Greek and Roman world. We see him wearing sandals and he's covered in this same way, and he has his loyal eagle that represents his power. So what happens with this night in which this museum was opened for the public to come and see the innovations that were taking place here, again, paid by the Wittgenstein family, Carl Wittgenstein, who was a man that was promoting these new arts and new ideas and a look to the future that was very different. And what happens in this opening night, where all of these magnificent things are on exhibition, we have Gustav Mahler, who is conducting the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which is all about the brotherhood of mankind. Gustav Mahler was known for his gesticulations on stage, and he was often made fun of. In any case, what we have is this glorious moment in which they open the Secession building. This young style becomes representational of the Viennese style. And Gustav Klimt continues to get these kind of private commissions in which he commands so much money for his work that only the wealthiest of wealthiest people can afford to have their portraits made by him. In fact, there's more than one person that wrote that he charged so much for his work because he never believed people would pay that kind of money, that they could have had a villa outside of town as sort of a weekend home, but instead people had that as well as their gorgeous wives painted into these memorable portraits. So this is Adele Bloch-Bauer that we're also familiar with because of that movie. Adele Bloch-Bauer's husband was enormously wealthy. Her father was enormously wealthy. This famous piece of jewelry is going to make its way into more than one portrait. It turned out that he worked on her portraits and he made numerous paintings of her for over 7 years. And it turned out in later years that Adele Bloch-Bauer was Gustav Klimt's mistress for at least 7 years, but that did not stop him from having lots of other entanglements with lots and lots and lots of other women. Here she is again as Judith in this extraordinary piece of jewelry as a response to Judith being shown here as sort of more evil intent. And Judith is supposed to be the great protector of her people. In later years, what will happen is that Adele Bloch-Bauer will want to control Klimt and keep him in her life so desperately that he will begin to paint her hands like claws that were digging into to keep him close to her. And then here's Oprah, who can never catch a break, bless her heart. Oprah bought this piece in 2006 and sold it not too many years later. Another portrait by Adele Bloch-Bauer. And there are many people that say that she is even the model for the kiss. Well, though it's been 100 years since Gustav Klimt died, he died in 1918. This is one of the last portraits he made. He is never far away from inspiration that artists take from him. This is, as you can see, Annie Leibovitz of Jessica Chastain. He died of a stroke, and probably because of his weakened state, the Spanish flu eventually was his undoing. Just